The sky cracks open. The oceans climb over the mountains and swallow the coastlines whole. The gods take up weapons against each other. The stars fall. And when the last fire dies, silence. A silence so complete it has no name. And then, from the nothing, something new begins. This is not one story. This is every story. Thousands of years ago, in places that had never heard of each other, in the frozen forests of Scandinavia, in the river valleys of ancient India, in the deserts of Persia, in the jungle cities of Mesoamerica, human beings looked at the world around them and saw the same terrible thing on the horizon. A total, irreversible end. An ending of everything they had built, believed, and loved. And here is the part that should stop you cold. They described it the same way. Welcome to Eternal Legends, the channel where the oldest stories in the world still have things to teach us. I'm glad you are here. If this is your first time, hit subscribe, because what we are about to go through is one of the most unsettling patterns in the entire history of human civilization. And if you have been with us for a while, you already know. The myths never lie. They just wait. Today we are asking the question that historians, philosophers, and mythologists have wrestled with for centuries. Why did every major civilization on Earth imagine the same ending? Why does the Norse Ragnarök sound like the Hindu Pralaya? Why does the Zoroastrian wreckage echo the Christian apocalypse? Why do the Aztec suns, the Greek ages of man, and the Mesopotamian flood carry the exact same skeleton underneath their skin? This is the story of the world's final chapter, written 100 times in 100 different languages by 100 different hands, and arriving at the same terrifying conclusion. Let's begin. Picture this. You are sitting in a library surrounded by the oldest surviving texts humanity has produced. You pull out the Norse Eddas, compiled in Iceland around the 13th century, but drawing on stories far older. Stories that Scandinavian peoples had kept alive through winter fires and spoken word for generations before anyone wrote them down. You read about Ragnarök. 3 consecutive winters with no summer in between. A period called Fimbulwinter, where crops fail, animals perish, and communities fracture under the unbearable weight of cold and hunger. Then the social order disintegrates. Brothers turn on each other. The ties of kinship, the deepest bonds in Norse society, dissolve. The wolf Fenrir, who had been bound by the gods, breaks free from his chains. The great world serpent Jormungandr releases its own tail from its mouth and begins to writhe toward the shore, driving the sea over the land. The god Heimdall blows the Gjallarhorn, the great horn, and the gods answer the call. What follows is a sequence of singular combats. Thor defeats Jormungandr, but falls from its venom after 9 steps. Odin is consumed by Fenrir. The gods fight and the gods fall. The world sinks beneath the sea. Then, silence. Then a new earth rises, green and clean from the water. A new sun crosses the sky. Survivors emerge. Life resumes. You set that aside. You pick up the Vishnu Purana, an ancient Sanskrit text from the Hindu tradition, rooted in sacred teachings thousands of years old. You read about Pralaya, the dissolution of the universe at the end of each cosmic age. Fire consumes the earth. Oceans absorb the continents. The gods withdraw. All of creation folds back into the formless absolute. Then, after a span of time too vast for the human mind to hold, a new universe is born. You put that down. You reach for the Avesta, the sacred scripture of Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest religions on Earth, originating in ancient Persia. You read about wreckage, the final renovation of existence, a cosmic battle between the forces of truth and the forces of destruction. a purifying river flowing across the land, the dead rising, a perfected world emerging from the wreckage. 3 separate civilizations, thousands of miles apart, centuries between them, no documented contact, and they told you the same story. This is the pattern that should not exist, and it exists everywhere. Let us be precise, because precision matters here. We are not talking about vague spiritual themes that could bend to fit anything. We are talking about specific structural elements that appear with almost mechanical regularity across cultures that had no known connection to each other. The first element is the Great Winter, or the Great Darkness. Fimbulwinter in Norse tradition. The withdrawal of the sun during the Hindu Final Age. The Aztec world plunging into cold and night when the 4th sun dies. The sun going dark and the moon turning to blood in the Book of Revelation. Across the globe, the end begins the same way. Light fails first. The second element is water. The flood is so universal it barely needs introduction. But what is striking is not simply that water appears, it is what water does. In almost every tradition, the flood is not random destruction. It is a cleansing, a reset. Water takes away a world that became unworthy and makes room for one that might do better. The third element is moral collapse. In Norse myth, the age before Ragnarök is called the Axe Age, the Sword Age, an era when decency disintegrates and people abandon all bonds of care. In Hindu tradition, the Kali Yuga, the final age of the current cycle, is defined by widespread dishonesty, greed, and the collapse of spiritual duty. In Hesiod's Works and Days from ancient Greece, the Iron Age, our current age, is one of relentless moral deterioration, where justice flees the earth. The world does not end because of bad luck or random misfortune. It ends because people choose badly, repeatedly, until there is nothing left worth saving. The fourth element is a surviving remnant. Someone always makes it through. In Norse myth, 2 humans shelter beneath the world tree Yggdrasil and emerge after Ragnarök to begin again. In the Mesopotamian tradition, Utnapishtim survives the Great Flood on a vessel carrying animals and seeds. In Zoroastrianism, a righteous figure named Yima builds a great enclosure to shelter the finest of humanity from the coming catastrophe. Noah in the biblical tradition needs no introduction. One survivor, one vessel, one new beginning. This is not coincidence. Something is driving this pattern. The question is what? Before we ask why, we need to spend time inside these stories themselves, because the details are where the real strangeness lives. The details are what make you sit back and stare at the ceiling. The Norse vision of Ragnarök is perhaps the most detailed account of world's end ever committed to mythology. It does not read like scripture. It reads like a dispatch from a war that has already been fought and lost and somehow survived. What makes it remarkable is not the destruction. It is the acceptance. The Norse gods know Ragnarök is coming. Odin knows. He has spent centuries preparing, gathering the greatest warriors who ever lived into the halls of Valhalla precisely to face this moment. He knows the outcome. He goes anyway. There is something in that, a civilization that looked at the certainty of ending and chose to meet it with open eyes rather than flinch away. And there is the detail about what survives. Not just 2 human beings. The world tree Yggdrasil itself survives Ragnarök. The great ash that holds the 9 worlds together is shaken to its roots, but it does not fall. And it is Yggdrasil that shelters the remnant. The tree that connects everything, the structure of existence itself, endures. The Norse imagination, even in total destruction, could not conceive of a world without structure. Something always holds. Now travel east to ancient India. Hindu cosmology does not see time the way most traditions do. Time is not a line moving from creation to apocalypse. It is a wheel, vast, rotating, and eternal. The universe moves through 4 ages called yugas before entering Pralaya. These 4 ages progressively decline from the Satya Yuga, a period of perfect truth and virtue, through the Treta Yuga and the Dvapara Yuga, until the Kali Yuga, our current age, in which falsehood, selfishness, and spiritual blindness hold the upper hand. What is extraordinary about the Hindu vision is the scale. The current Kali Yuga is said to last 432,000 years. A full cycle of all 4 yugas lasts 4,320,000 years. And that is only one cycle. There are 71 such cycles in a single day of Brahma, the creator god. And a day of Brahma is 4,320,000,000 years. And then a night of Brahma follows, of equal length, during which existence dissolves entirely back into the formless, Pralaya, before the next day begins and creation starts again. The Hindu sages who built this framework were not writing poetry. They were doing cosmology. And the scale they chose to work with dwarfs anything the modern scientific imagination has produced in terms of sheer temporal grandeur. At the end of the Kali Yuga, a figure called Kalki is said to arrive. A warrior on a white horse carrying a blazing sword, the final avatar of the god Vishnu. Not to redeem the world, but to close an age that has exhausted itself. Kalki does not come to save. He comes to end, so that something better can begin. Now step into ancient Persia. Zoroastrianism is arguably the world's oldest surviving monotheistic tradition, and it gave Western civilization ideas that never fully left, including, many scholars argue, the very concept of a final historical apocalypse that carries a moral meaning. The Zoroastrian end time is called frashokareti, and the translation of that word is important. It does not mean destruction. It does not mean collapse or ruin. It means the making wonderful. In the Zoroastrian framework, history is a long, deliberate conflict between Ahura Mazda, the supreme force of truth, light, and creation, and Angra Mainyu, the force of destruction, falsehood, and the unmade. This conflict has a predetermined endpoint. A world savior called Saoshyant arrives. The dead are resurrected. All souls pass through a great river of molten metal. The righteous feel it as warm milk flowing over them. Those who chose falsehood experience it as fire. The world is purified down to its foundations and then made perfect, permanently. The fire is not the end. The fire is what the transformation looks like from the outside. Tell me, write it in the comments, which of these 3 endings feels most like something a human being actually feared in the dark of night? The cold and the long silence of Ragnarök? The vast and impersonal turning of the Hindu cosmic wheel? Or the burning river of Frashokareti, where everything you were is tested in a single crossing? I want to know what lands hardest for you. And before we move on, cross the Atlantic for a moment to the Aztec tradition. The Aztecs believed the world we inhabit is the 5th sun. The 4 suns before it each ended in a specific catastrophe. The first by jaguars, the second by wind, the third by a great rain of fire, the fourth by flooding. Each age held humanity in some form. Each age was erased and replaced. The Aztecs knew with complete certainty that the 5th sun would also end. Their remarkably sophisticated ritual calendar was partly designed to delay that ending, to keep the cosmic machinery turning through ceremony, dedication, and devotion. When the calendar reached certain critical points, there was genuine communal fear. The world might simply stop. Think about what it takes to build a civilization on that foundation. One of the most architecturally sophisticated cultures in the pre-Columbian Americas, a city at Tenochtitlan that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. And every person in it went to sleep knowing they were living on borrowed time, under a sun already marked for death. We have seen the patterns. Now we do the harder work. Why? Why do civilizations with no documented contact arrive at nearly identical visions of the world's end? There are several serious answers, and none of them fully satisfies on its own. The honest answer is probably a combination of all of them. And the combination itself tells us something. The first answer is the simplest. Human beings everywhere face the same existential facts. We are mortal. Our communities are mortal. Everything we build will eventually collapse or be forgotten. The fear of endings is not cultural. It is biological. Every human mind, regardless of geography or language, has to confront the reality that nothing lasts. Myths of the end are, on this reading, the largest possible scale expression of a universal human anxiety. We fear our own death. Civilizations fear their own death. And a myth-making culture eventually asks, what would the death of everything look like? Flood, fire, and darkness are the most powerful natural forces available to human experience. Of course they appear. Of course they repeat. But that answer, while true, does not go far enough. Because the specific structural similarities run too deep. It is not just that every tradition imagines some catastrophe. It is that they imagine the same sequence. Moral collapse first, then environmental catastrophe, then total destruction, then renewal, then a remnant carrying something essential forward. That sequence is too precise to be explained by shared psychology alone. The second answer is environmental memory. And this one is genuinely powerful. Roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted across the globe. This was not a gradual process everywhere. In certain coastal regions, it happened with devastating speed. Settlements that had existed for generations disappeared beneath the sea within human lifetimes. Entire landscapes were erased. Some researchers have argued, and the geological record increasingly supports this, that the universal flood myth is not metaphor, but memory. A deeply encoded recollection of real catastrophic inundation, passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years before any civilization existed to write it down. If your ancestors survived a genuine regional or even global flood event, would you not build that into the foundational story of your world? Around 12,900 years ago, a period called the Younger Dryas began. A sudden, sharp return to near Ice Age cold that lasted roughly 1,200 years. Temperatures dropped fast. Megafauna went extinct across multiple continents. Human populations declined significantly. A growing body of scientific evidence suggests this period may have been triggered in part by a cosmic impact event. Fragments of a comet or asteroid striking the Earth's atmosphere and surface with enough force to alter the climate. If that is true, if the ancestors of the Norse, the Aztecs, the Hindus, and the Zoroastrians all descended from populations that experienced fire from the sky, a killing cold, and the sudden death of the great animals, then the apocalyptic imagery in their myths is not imagination. It is inheritance. Stars fall from heaven in Revelation. Fire rains from the sky in the Aztec third sun. The Norse world freezes before it burns. Environmental trauma, remembered and carried forward across hundreds of generations, dressed in the language of the sacred, so it would survive. The third answer is political collapse, and this one is the quietest, but perhaps the most thoroughly documented. The Bronze Age collapse, which unfolded between roughly 1200 and 1100 BC, remains one of history's great unsolved catastrophes. Within the space of about 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, the city of Ugarit, the Egyptian New Kingdom, either fell apart entirely or was severely weakened. Trade networks that had sustained international commerce for centuries died overnight. Writing disappeared from some regions for generations. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were abandoned. No single cause has ever been agreed upon by historians. Drought, invasion, systems collapse, internal breakdown, all have been proposed, and all may be partly true. And what happened to the sacred stories of the cultures that survived the Bronze Age collapse? They remembered it. But they did not remember it as an economic report or a military history. They remembered it as the gods withdrawing from the world, as the moral order breaking down beyond repair, as fire from heaven and the passing of a golden age. Political catastrophe encoded as sacred narrative. Myth as the only language large enough to hold grief of that scale without shattering. This is why, when you read about the final age in so many traditions, it reads less like an imagined future and more like testimony from a world that already ended. The Kali Yuga's description of dishonest leaders, neglected spiritual duties, and collapsed social bonds reads like a detailed account of a failing state. The Norse age before Ragnarök, with its picture of kinship bonds dissolving and communities turning on each other, reads like the account of a refugee. These are not invented nightmares. They are lived ones, dressed in cosmic language so they could be carried forward and perhaps understood by someone, someday, who needed to know. Here is what I want you to carry with you when this ends. Every tradition we have looked at today shares one final structural element that we have not talked about enough. The ending is never just an ending. It is always followed by something better. Ragnarök ends with a new, green earth rising from the sea. Pralaya ends with a new Satya Yuga, a return to the age of perfect truth and virtue. Frashokareti ends with the world made permanently wonderful. The Aztec fifth sun exists because 4 previous suns were each destroyed and replaced. Even the most catastrophic mythological endings in the entire human record contain, somewhere at the bottom, a seed. That is not an accident. And it is not naive optimism. It is something much harder and more earned than optimism. Think about what it actually takes to build that idea into the foundational stories of your civilization. You have experienced something real. Famine, flooding, plague, invasion, the complete collapse of everything familiar. You have survived it. Barely. And you have chosen, deliberately chosen, to tell the story of that experience not only as loss, but as the necessary precondition for something new. You have taken the worst thing that ever happened to your people and turned it into a map. The Norse poets who composed the Eddas were not writing from a position of comfort and security. Their world was harsh and short. They knew what a genuine winter felt like from the inside. They knew what it meant when the crops failed 2 years in a row. They knew what communities did to each other under that kind of pressure. And they chose to imagine that even the death of the gods, even the total destruction of the universe as they knew it, was not the final word on the matter. The Indian sages who described Pralaya did not flinch from the scale of what they were imagining. They looked at the dissolution of an entire universe, everything, every star, every world, every living thing, and they said, yes. And then a new one. Not diminished, not lesser, a new one, beginning again with the age of perfect truth. The Zoroastrian tradition insisted that the catastrophic purification was not punishment. It was renovation. Frashokareti, the making wonderful. The fire is not the end. The fire is what the transformation looks like from the outside when you are standing too close to see the whole picture. Does that sound like despair to you? Because I do not think it is. I think it is something much rarer. I think it is the deepest form of hope a human being can sustain. Not the hope that things will not fall apart, but the hope that even if they do, something worth preserving will come through the other side. These traditions knew something that we sometimes lose sight of in times of difficulty. That endings and beginnings share the same moment. That the force which destroys one world is, in the same breath, the thing that opens the space for the next one. That the people who survive catastrophe carry within them everything worth keeping. And that the act of carrying it forward, of holding it through the darkness, is itself a form of victory that the darkness cannot touch. Now ask yourself the harder question that these myths are quietly placing in front of you. We live in an era of environmental disruption, political fragmentation, widespread anxiety about the future, and a deep uncertainty about where the current age is heading. We did not invent these fears. Human beings have held them before, in different languages, under different skies, worshiping different gods, and they process those fears by building the most durable stories in human history. Stories precise enough to survive the death of the very civilizations that created them. Stories passed from mouth to ear to mouth, across 100 generations until they reached us, still intact, still carrying the same warning, still pointing toward the same pattern. Moral decline, environmental catastrophe, the long winter, a total collapse of the familiar order. And then, if enough people hold the right things through the dark, a new green earth. The myths of the end were never only about the end. They were instructions. Take what is worth keeping. Build something that can outlast the cold. Hold the seed. Wait for the spring. And before you go, drop a comment below. Tell me which of these traditions surprised you most today. Was it the precise blow-by-blow sequence of Ragnarök? The incomprehensible cosmic scale of the Hindu Pralaya? The moral architecture of Frashokareti, where the fire judges everything? Or did something else land harder? Tell me what hit you. I read every comment, and your response to these stories matters. This has been Eternal Legends, where the oldest stories in the world still have things to teach us. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this with someone who loves the deep history of human thought. And we will see you in the next one, because the legends never die. They just wait for someone to listen.